Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about League of Dragons by Naomi Novik. And oh my god, did I actually finish a series? Why yes, I did! This is the last of the Temeraire books, and I think it's a really solid ending to a solid series. So yes, this is the last book of a series, so do expect there to be some spoilers in this review for all the previous books. As usual, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers for this book in particular, but I'm going to have to mention things that happen in book 1 through 8. So if you have not read them, yeah, maybe take a pause, go read those 8 books, watch my 8 reviews, and then come back to this one. But on that note, this book starts with Lawrence and Temeraire chasing Napoleon's troops after the Emperor's disastrous campaign in Russia. While they do not succeed in catching him, it finally looks like this war is going their way. Until Tharke shows up with the news that Temeraire's egg, which has been left behind in China for the Emperor to be the companion of, has been stolen, or is at risk of being stolen. And their desperate flight to stop this egregious act will uncover the information that will end the war, whether that be for good or bad. And I actually find this one a bit of a beast to synopsize. Like, when I sat down to write that little synopsis, I could not figure out how to phrase it. Because while I like this book, while I think it's a really solid ending to the series, it's a bit of a mess when you actually just sort of examine it as a standalone book. And the thing is, there are so many threads that need to be wrapped up in this book, because there have been so many little plots, themes, and elements that have been put into play in the last 8 books. But the weird thing is, I wouldn't actually say that that's why this book has such messy plotting. It's not one of those books where it feels like basically we're revisiting old plot threads for a second, tying them off, and then moving on, and it just feels like basically 7 million little conclusion scenes. No, while I was reading this, it never felt like Novik was bringing up things just to put them to bed. Instead, it was a book that covers, I would say, around triple the amount of just pure plot action than any of the other books. There are huge time skips in this one, and some of them are skipping events that I feel would usually be included because they would be dramatic to read. Not because they're necessary to the story, as proven by the fact that I didn't really mind their absence here, but it felt like the sort of stuff that usually a book would want to include because there was, dramatic action. This would be a great conclusion. But because the scene is happening, a tenth of the way through the book, they're not going to include another battle. There's no need for us to read another battle. We've read dozens of battles already. But I do get the feeling this book was really basically... The book itself felt like it was trying to grow into 2 to 3 books, but Novik either wanted or needed this series to have 9 books. And possibly because it's the number of letters in the name, and each of them have a little letter on the spine, but I really doubt that's the only reason. I'm guessing way back at the beginning when she sat down to write these, she plotted them out as 9 books, and then she got to this last one and just realized there was a buttload of plot in here. And she just sort of forced the events to all fit in one book. And I really don't think that's a flaw. It's the sort of thing that I did not notice at all while I was reading it. It's only when I sat down to summarize it that I was like, wait, all that happened in this one book? That was a lot of events that, yes, are causally linked, but are less thematically linked than usual. Like, it doesn't have quite the shape of a normal book. It's a buttload of little climaxes. And this is something I noticed in this series before. It's very, very clear to me that Naomi Novik planned this series very carefully from the beginning, and so each book is first and foremost a part of the greater whole. And after that, it's a book on its own right. And that's not actually exceptionally rare in fantasy epics. Like, when you get a series that is more than, 5 books, or honestly, more than 3 books, almost always there is that feeling of okay, this is the shape of the entire series. Or, there's another option. They either work that it feels sort of like we just cut off this book at the right page number, and it's just okay, this is part of a greater whole, this is all one continuous story that's too long to fit in one book. Or the other option is each book stands very much as a standalone and barely really plays into the greater whole until like halfway through the series when suddenly things start coalescing a bit better. The ones that always pop into my mind is just looking at the Jim Butcher books, the difference between the Dresden Chronicles, which are episodic for the first like 10 books. And yeah, they're picking up little details that are building towards a greater story, but it's not itself a greater story. Versus the Furies of Calderon series, which at the end of the first book you're going, yeah, this is part of a greater whole, this barely stands as its own book. There are so many plot threads left uncovered, there are so many things that were introduced that, you know, don't have conclusions, and yeah, there was a climax, but it could have been a mid-act climax rather than an end-of-a-book climax. And this is the rare series I feel like somehow straddles both lines. Like, yes, each book does read thematically as a standalone individual book, but there are so many little bits and scenes and pieces here and there that exist more as part of the series than part of the individual book that there is no way you can finish reading any of these and not go, yeah, this is part of a greater series. We're already moving towards the conclusion. I can see the shape of it already from like book one. And like that's something I honestly appreciated because I don't tend to like to read series all at once. I like reading one book, taking a break to read something else, and picking up the next one when I have the impulse to pick up the next one. Which is just a lot more fulfilling when each book does work a bit better as a standalone. But if they work too well as a standalone, I tend to never get around to picking up the next one because I felt that feeling of completion when I finished the first one. And to me, this one also pulls off that same trick. It does feel like both a standalone and part of a series. It's just with an insane amount of plot shoved in the middle. Like, especially, like, the beginning and the end both feel very thematically linked. They feel like this is all part of the whole. And there are callbacks to the theme throughout the book, but there are so many more of those scenes that it's like, yeah, this is a conclusionary element to the entire series, not this book. And it still very much has cohesive themes. And some of the themes were themes from the overall series, and some were a little bit more specific to this book. The most obvious is a theme that is across the entire series, but it's so much more concentrated in this one. It really feels like, yeah, this is the moment we're going to fully, really inhabit the theme of what cost victory? What is it worth to get your victory? Is winning dishonorably worth it? Is it acceptable to sacrifice the lives of others? Where is the line between enemies and allies dying in battle and the wanton, inhumane killing of civilians? Like, what is the line? And the book sets you up from scene one. Like, the very first scene in this book is the heroes putting down a French dragon, putting her out of her misery when she's already dying of cold and hunger, and our heroes thinking about the cost of this war, and all these dragons that have just been let die, and all the people who have been left to die for what is really a needless war. And, like, yeah, is it so much worse to die while fleeing battle than to die in battle? And the theme comes up again and again and again, and the book doesn't shy away from showing us the moments when our heroes are a bit of hypocrites, and I really appreciate that. There are moments when the mass destruction caused by war is mentioned right after or before we see our heroes drawing a line and saying, I'm not willing to do that. And then, like, it's just skimmed over. Oh yeah, and that dragon fell and killed probably 100 people. And it's just like, it's really honest about the way it approaches it. And I like the fact that the theme has been here from the very beginning. Like, the very first book touches on this, asking us, is it right to ask the dragons to fight for people who would oppress them and who do oppress them? Asking, is it unfair to turn dragons against humans because they are so much more powerful? Asking, if the enemy gives them more rights than your allies, should you be fighting that enemy? And I think it lands the dismount on this theme exceptionally well, reminding the reader that the innocents end up just as dead in an honorable war as a dishonorable war. But there are still lines that frankly just should not be crossed. And it's still good and worthy to draw lines in the sand and to refuse to cross them, even if, yes, you have done some terrible things. And you can walk away from a war feeling dirty, but peace is still worth it in the end. That you can bend your morals without breaking them, and that moral decisions are never easy. One of the things that I feel like is constantly present in this book in particular is the fact that there is no one answer. And like, it's one of those things that like it has to be reevaluated in every single time. And every single time you have to make the active choice to do the moral thing. And every single time it's difficult. And every single time you have to fight for it. And all you can do is make the best decision you can at that moment. And that's a theme I can get behind. I really agree with this, and I agree with the overall grayness of the way it's handled, because war, in many ways, in its own core, is, you know, dishonorable. It's inhumane. The very idea of trying to paint honor on something where people are dying over what really should be fixed with just discussion, and like the idea of like, why is Napoleon conquering all of Europe? Pride. Is it worth it to die for this? No, but what is better, to just let it happen or to fight for it? And like, it's a constant conversation in this book and in the entire series, and I think it's really interesting, and it's one that I can see many different people coming away from it with different opinions about, like, what are the answers to these questions. And I've just said it before in many of my reviews, I'm much more interested in themes that are questions than themes that are answers. If a book tries to tell me how to feel, I'm probably not gonna like the theme nearly as much as if a book just asks, okay, what do you think? Here's a setup, here's what we're talking about, what do you think? Was this right? Was this good? And I think this book does that. But on a second note, I love the fact that this book ends with a "there's still work to be done" kind of ending. Those are my favorite kinds of endings, especially for complete series, because they allow me to imagine more adventures without feeling the obligation to, you know, continue reading forever. They feel like less of a goodbye, but also they feel like a more accurate ending to me. Like, even at my most optimistic, and I am naturally I tend towards optimism person, or at least I struggle to tend towards optimism, but even so, I struggle to truly believe a completely happily ever after ending. Like, if you don't imply that there is some struggles left, I'm probably going to look a little bit askance at you. And it's just like, to me, if there is no struggle, there is no life. Like, a complete, like, and they were happily forever, they never had to fight another battle, they never had another argument, that sounds like death, because that sounds like heaven, and you only get to heaven through death. And so, like, it doesn't quite work for me when an ending is too completely happy. And I've long thought that was because, oh yeah, you need to see some of the struggle of the, like, what, you know, the previous books happened, but I think it's more than that. I need to see the concept that there is continuing struggling, that you do have to keep fighting. And also, this is a theme I love in a book. A statement that, yeah, it is a never-ending quest to make the world better. You can rest on your laurels, but eventually you have to either abandon the world or gird your loins to continue the fight for good. And if you're doing it right, the subsequent fights should be easier. Each one should be less violent. Each one should be more gentle. But there will always be another fight. There will always be someone else whose rights you need to stand up for. There will always be some other problem that needs slightly fixed. Like, there is no such thing as perfection. There is only striving for perfection. And to me, the ending of this book really struck that perfect balance. Like, no spoiler for history here, but Napoleonic Wars eventually end. And Napoleon loses. And they also end in this book. But the dragons still do have a fight for rights. They are still, you know, looking for more freedoms. They still need to work for things. And I like the fact that the fight for rights did progress pretty quickly through these 9 books, but it's a lot more believable than a lot of books that try to hand wave away. And then the rights got better, because dragons, while a very interesting stand-in for marginalized communities, and like the books do a lot of really interesting things with that, they're never going to be a perfect stand-in for marginalized communities. The dragons some of them are as big as a house, they fly, some of them breathe fire, some of them have other powers. The important thing is they are weapons, and they are the equivalent of, tanks that fly. So, yeah, they are never going to be a perfect stand-in for marginalized communities, because the reason most communities are marginalized is they lack power. And so, yeah, letting them have a super advanced progress of rights actually really works because they have so much power. But major themes aside, I also really like the continuing character journeys in this book. While it is played a bit for humor, Temeraire's desperate attempt to overcome his greed for wealth was just super cute. Like, I like seeing him struggle, and I like seeing him make the good choices, and I do sort of like the fact that the good choices are inspired by others. And sometimes they are a bit of a mistake, but, that is sometimes the forward progress that you get. And it's just a fun take on the traditional dragon's tendency to hoard, like the idea that dragons are greed monsters. I like the humanization of, yeah, he is a greed monster, but, he's trying to be better. I also love Lawrence's journey of coming to see which parts of honor actually matter and which sort of don't. And I love the fact that in the end, he still does care about appearances. He does still care about that part of honor that's not really that important. And it still bothers him, but in the end, he recognizes that there are other things that are more important. And the outcome in the end is more important than how they got there in many ways. And I absolutely loved the way history sort of circles back around to match our history, like the history of this book circles around to match the history of the real world, while also working in this newly imagined history. Though personally, I did keep getting a bit distracted by my pity for poor Josephine, written summarily out of the story, just replaced entirely by another character. And, if there's one thing I knew about Napoleon historically, it's that, yeah, he did love his wife, and nope, she's just gone. But in the end, I appreciate having another powerful female ruler in her stead. And while that is a very interesting character, we're not really supposed to like her too much. I like seeing her in this book. I love the way the Aerial Corps starts out sort of super slowly, subtly becoming more and more essential element of the war, and that's really what shifts the history in these books away from our real world history into this fictional history, and it opens up the history to more wildly different storytelling, and the dragons sort of start out as a novel addition to the war, but they're not super impactful, they're just sort of there, and it's because it makes a logical sense in the book because neither force are really using them in exceptionally creative ways, and neither of them are really acknowledging what use they can be put to. But in the end, the books sort of really center around them as a deciding factor to the war, and it makes the warfare feel both more modern and more personal at the same time. And I think that part of the complication of the plot here was working what had become a very different set of historical facts into an ending that would much more closely resemble the history we know in our world. But with still a lot more hope for egalitarianism. And, yeah, I will admit that's one of the things that made me like this book a lot more than a lot of books based in historical fiction. Because, yeah, I often do have struggles caring too much about the characters when I know how the real history went. But in this book, there's just enough difference with the dragons who are not just the dragons are heading for greater rights. The dragons sort of become an emblem for the fight for greater equality across all of mankind as well, and they actually do become tools towards the equality across all mankind. Because, in this world's version, people who end up being very abused by the Western world have a lot more power because they have their own dragons on their own side. And it just makes the history a bit more fun to imagine and to play with. It's basically just a fun set of tools. I will also never get over the fact that even though it's not canonical at all, it's not like the ending is my ship, the ending does open up the possibility of my favorite ship developing into a real thing. And yes, I know that this is not really that important. No matter how analytical I try to be in my reviews, The simple joy of loving characters and wanting to see them happy together will always have a greater impact on my enjoyment of a story than any number of logical evaluations of the structure of the book, or the style of the prose, or the quality of the world building. In the end, if I am not in love with your characters enough that I want to play with them like dolls and make them kiss, then chances are your book's not going to hold a place in my heart. And I feel like I should apologize to all my literature professors I have ever had about that fact. Like, I know that this is not the way I'm supposed to read books, but you know what? I don't care. Because in the end, to build characters that someone cares about that inherently is an amazing art form. And to me, at least, the most important part about books is building empathy for others and learning to, like, letting yourself see yourself in other people's shoes. And yeah, that means I need to fall in love with your characters. So, yeah, if there's not some art behind the composition of your characters, you're not going to be able to get me to want to ship them with anyone. So, you know what? Screw it. It's a valid argument. I promise. Like, the fact that I want to ship characters means it's a good book, I swear. But other than that, the story, while a bit piecemeal, never lost my interest at all. It was fun, it was impactful, even deeply gripping at many points. I feel like it's the absolute right amount of action in this book. Like I mentioned before that we skip over a lot of battle scenes and a lot of what would be considered action scenes, and even just skip a lot of time within the battles. But I feel like that was the right thing. There is enough battles and action scenes in here that you don't feel unfulfilled, and including them all would have made for a very plodding read. I will also say, I do have some mixed feelings on the character Ning. She was interesting, but I don't know. I feel like she was just a lot of a character to introduce this close to the end of the series. And because of the nature of just so much happening, we just didn't end up with enough time for her character to be resolved. And in certain ways I like that, because like it does give that open ending feeling that I like at the end of a series, but at the same time, she's almost too much open-ended. Like, she feels a bit like sequel bait to me, which I don't like after 9 books. I'll be honest, as much as I love book series, like, I'm a fantasy reader, of course I read a lot of long series, but I find that the older I get, the more willing I am to admit that I just want them to end at a point. I don't want them to keep going and going and going and going. And when they mainly because when they keep going and going and going and going, they always feel like they need to raise the stakes. They need to keep pushing harder and harder and harder. And quite often, that ruins why I liked the series in the first place. I do like my series a bit more episodic, and the longer series go on, they tend towards less episodic. And I know it's silly, especially when I talked about the fact that, like, I like the series to feel like they could go on, but I also want them to feel like they have a distinct end. And for me, this one did that with everything except Ning. She just felt incomplete without a second series, and at the same time, I don't like the character enough that if a second series of books came out, I would be willing to buy them. Like, that would not draw me in. I found her a little bit annoying, and I think I was supposed to. And, like, she is another thematic element talking with the question of, you know, if, you know, you have a good outcome, does it matter if you did it for bad reasons? Does it matter that she is a plotting character who very clearly is in it for her own selfish reasons, when her own selfish reasons are leading towards peace? Like, is that a problem? And, like, it's very thematically interesting. It's just, I don't like her as a character. And, yeah, she just didn't feel resolved, whereas the rest of the theme really did feel like it was giving us enough to, you know, find our own resolution. But I don't know. I think I'm still working out my feelings on her, and I feel like in about a week I'll be like, oh yeah, I know exactly how I feel about Ning. But everything else about this series, I am completely happy with. Part of the reason I rarely rush to finish a series is I feel like they rarely stick the ending for me. I'm either usually deeply sad at the end of the series, feeling like, oh, well, that's over, now what the hell do I do? or feeling a little bit unfulfilled. Like, it has to be that perfect level of open for me to really enjoy the end of a series. And I think this one hit it perfectly. I really appreciate Novik's writing. I appreciate what she's done with it. I've appreciated the depth of it. I've appreciated the silliness of it. I will admit, there's an excerpt from Deadly Education in the back, and it's the only time I've ever read an excerpt and gone, oh, okay, no, that one's not for me. I am going to read more of Naomi Novik. I even have one of her books, Spinning Silver, is up on my TBR shelf, but I'm not sure the Scholomance series is for me. I feel like it's too dark and gritty. But overall, the Temeraire series was perfect. This is another one of this is going to be on my list of favorite series. And yes, I'd vote Temeraire for Parliament.